Hello! So I didn't have time to film a video in the studio this week for various reasons, but I thought I'd get something out, so I thought I'd make a little quick video where I just looked through the comments that I got on my previous two videos. And I had to close my window and switch my fan off to do this, so you'd better appreciate it. The UK is in a bit of a heat wave, if no one was aware of that, or at least for us anyway, and we are not used to that kind of weather. Anyway, yeah, I thought I'd read through some of the comments. I do try to reply to the comments on my videos, so I've replied to most of these comments already, but I figured that some people don't read them, so I might as well just go through and make a little video about it. I try to also incorporate them and cover the elements that are questions that are brought up in future videos and in the scripts for future videos, but I can't always catch everything, so I thought it would be easy if I just read through them and responded here. Luckily enough, I've got an audience enough to get some engagement, but not like a crazy amount of engagement. I did monitor a project once in the past that would regularly get hundreds of sort of comments and responses, and 100 isn't like a lot, but it's immediately unmanageable. So we hit triple figures and it just becomes impossible to keep up with. So I've got a good level here that I can respond to the comments. Yeah, so I'm going to be looking through my previous two, the story and RPG videos, and the ones I'm sort of trying to break down my philosophy and on why story is important and how I like to run games so that you're not bogged down with story, and more importantly you're not railroading your players, because that is bad. Some games are designed for it. Paranoia, I often mention, is very much designed to be a railroaded story, and it kind of only works within those parameters because the players are supposed to feel powerless. But as much as I'd love it to cover all the bases, I can't always hit everything, and people point stuff out to me, so I'm going to go in chronological order of when they came in. I'm not going to hit every single comment. I'm going to hit stuff that had questions or brought up points that I hadn't thought of, and things like that. First up, about 6 minutes in, and I feel like I have to stop and disagree with the notion that RPGs are just about story. You know what, this is fair. I get a few comments like this every now and then and people responding. It's a fair comment. I personally think that running having a story, or at least the semblance of one, is a superior way to run these games. I wouldn't want to play in a hacky slashy dungeon crawly kind of game. That would be very boring to me, because the mechanics of, say, like the more complex games like D&D don't interest me. But I recognise that those games exist and you can play the game that way, and the game is designed, D&D particularly, those sorts of games are designed to be played that way in a lot of ways, because they are not very good at being played the other way, which is why I prefer other RPGs, more narrative RPGs. The same comment, in my opinion, RPGs are both collaborative storytelling and collaborative problem solving. Some people really like problem solving using game mechanics, and TTRPGs give them the freedom to do that in a way that nothing else really does. Again, yeah, that's sort of true. You can be, it's kind of a, I would, like I say that board games and video games serve this better. But they are very restrictive, those systems. A board game has a very clear set of parameters you cannot deviate outside of, and a video game even more so. And people want to delve into those areas of play and play in this freer universe where their creative thinking is rewarded. You can't be that creative in a video game. It tends to have a fixed solution because that's just how it works. Is how they can't program in every single possible thing a player could ever think to be able to do. You've got to have mechanics within the game that you are very much hindered by. I just think that's that feels more like problem solving to me, whereas if I have to figure out an exact solution, or if I can work out from a handful of solutions, whereas if I'm problem solving in a world where I can do anything, it's not really problem solving at all. I'm just goofing around and stumbling to a conclusion as the game's being run by somebody who probably wants me to win, because otherwise the game comes to a dead stop. The GM should be happy to have their players fail and die if that's what they have walked into, but ultimately the GM wants the players to win and succeed because they want the game to keep going. They want everyone to be having fun. You don't want your game to just suddenly hit a dead end. If you can do anything, you're not really solving a puzzle. You're not really like concluding, because everything's stacked in your favour even more so. It's like playing a video game with the cheat codes on. You can do whatever, and it doesn't matter what the kind of logical solution is, because you can find another way around it. You can find a million ways around it. That's fun. That's the fun. That's the role-playing element that is a lot of fun, I will completely admit. but for whatever reason, that exact brand of it is just lost on me. I have a question. I get moving with the flow of the players, it's what I try to practice, but once working out what direction you're going for the next game, you talk about minimum prep. What sort of prep / notes do you have? And they go on to say, I'm guessing this too depends on the situation, but I'm super curious what sorts of prep you think is worth spending time on. So I am an anomaly. Oh, in fact, that's what I said in response. I am an anomaly. I do very little prep, like absurdly little prep. I've got into quite major sessions with essentially no prep whatsoever, other than like a vague idea of where I think the session could go. And it doesn't often go in that direction because the players will do whatever. But I have like a vague idea of a couple of outcomes depending on what the players might do. And if one of those happens, great, but otherwise I'm prepared. Those are usually enough parameters for me to improvise around to figure out the next stage. Prep-wise, I try to keep track of character names and NPC names and place names, but I'm also quite bad at that. And I will often ask the players, what the hell was this called again? Does anyone remember this NPC's name? Because I've forgotten and I didn't write it down. That's happened in my D&D games, because they sort of come up on the fly. But I try to build the world in a way that A, makes sense, and B, fits what the players want. So if the players ask me if there's something in a city and I hadn't planned for it, but it logically would be there, then I'm happy to have that be there. Happy to have you can find that, and then I will invent that thing on the fly, without really having a plan for it. My philosophy, partly on that, is that everything should be something. So I will say something. I will describe something, a person, a place, or whatever, and I will give them something. I will give them a little thing that makes them unique in this world. It might be a strange look, a way that they talk or act, something curious about their sort of existence. It could be extreme, it could be relatively small, and then if that thing becomes a major, that person or that place or whatever becomes a major plot point, or the characters keep repeatedly coming back to it, I can expand on that one thing, and build from there. But it doesn't have to be, I don't have to understand a complex character. I don't have to understand their NPC's motivations or their life story or their everything else. I just need one thing, and if the players choose to come back to that NPC, I can expand on it, ad infinitum, as much as they want, add another little bit of it, and a little bit, and a little bit, and a little bit. And sometimes those things have become massive plot arcs, like huge ones, like players just fall into an NPC's orbit and enjoy them so much that they just become more important than I had intended them. And I guarantee that my players will not be able to tell the difference between NPCs I had intended to be important and NPCs I had not, because you just will not. I am ready to run with whatever. In terms of prep, I will try and end my sessions in a somewhat logical conclusion, and I will generally ask my players, or like a downtime moment, and I will generally ask my players what their plan is next, or I will kind of try and ascertain what their next goal is, so that I know what they intend to do. They might change their mind, but they don't usually, so that I know what their sort of thinking is next. And I don't think that kind of conversation breaks the meta of the game. I think it's important to have, so that I have a vague idea of what they would like to achieve, and I can then plan the next session or elements of the next session to that, rather than what I want to happen or what I think should happen. I will plan it to what the players would like to happen or would like to be doing. I might mess with them a little bit, and like turn things against them or turn things around on them, but I will generally, try. That's the sort of the only real prep that I do, is to try and ascertain between sessions what it is that the players are wanting to achieve. Always do what the players want to do, and don't prep things and force your players into them. You've always got to build on what the players are interested in, and it's perfectly fine to have an open conversation to find out what that is that they want to go and do, or what they want to achieve. Physical prep, it's all in my head. I will make maps on Roll20 sometimes, if I had a particular spark of like an idea for what a battle map particularly could look like, but not often. I will often just have a small selection of things that are kind of generic maps that I will throw the players onto, or I will draw one on the Roll20 sort of drawing. But mostly I will theatre of the mind, just because that's what interests me. That doesn't necessarily work great with D&D. I would say D&D is definitely better served by having maps and minis, because that's just the way the game is written. You can theatre of the mind it, I do, but it's just not quite as crisp. Again, another reason why I sort of prefer other systems. This isn't really a question, but I'll touch on it anyway. I know that this is a bit philosophical, but stories from an ending point of view are always linear and irreversible. The tree scheme is more of an idea of possible dynamics than an applicated reality. So yeah, I think this is where a lot of people butt heads against the concept of using these games as storytelling devices, or you teaching their dungeon master, game master as a storyteller, is because they assume that a story is pre-written. And a story isn't pre-written at all. Any writer will tell you that they often have no idea, and the thing that they had planned isn't what they ended up with anyway. Writing is not a purely linear process, and a lot of writers, myself included, will not have the ending in mind when they start, and they will come to an ending at some point, but even that ending might be disposable, and it might change. So the idea that a storytelling is a fixed structure is the foolishness that I often talk about. That's the mindset that these people are in that is wrong. That is not how it works. Storytelling is, to me, is applying logic to what is happening. It's applying an outside force to the machinations of the players that ties things together. And you can have a branching story and have an idea of every possibility that the players will go to, but in my opinion that's silly. You only need the one story, and that's the one thing that the players are doing. You only need to plan one step. You only need to be one step ahead of the players, and even then you don't even really need to be that. You only need to be on the same page as the players and keeping up with them whilst they lead you where they want to go, and you can build your story on from that. And if you're smart about it, and I'll talk about this in a future video in more detail, you can build the logic of the next step based off of all the seeds that you've placed in before. You don't need to have the final parts of your lore. I said this in the live stream we did the other day. You don't need to have the big lore element of your game in mind. You can, when your players eventually get to it, you can take all the little bits that you've said, little bits that you've seeded along the way, tie them all together, and then make the lore on the fly. Not on the fly, but you can make the lore in the moment when it becomes relevant. The impression I often get from Critical Role is that Matt has done a lot of work building his world and his lore, and he understands it very well, and he's basically just sort of waiting to tell it to the players, and that is, I mean, it's fine, but it's a good way to do things, but it ends up forcing your players in certain directions because they can only do certain things ultimately. If it's all that sort of thing is fixed, then the world has a logic to it that the players are slaves to, and they can't make so many changes. I would rather build my lore on what interests the players have found and what philosophical elements they have taken on board, how they treat the world, and build the lore off of that. It's hard to explain perhaps, but hopefully that kind of makes a vague point. I had a hard time trying to have my players understand the phrase, "You cannot make a bad or wrong choice in my game." So much so they would argue the point if things went wrong for them that our choice had been made, they would just insist there had been a better choice to make. Right, yeah, so this is players who say they don't want to be railroaded, but they secretly do. They secretly want a fixed puzzle that they can find the solution to, and that's not what role-playing games are. That's not how it works. You can run a game like that, fine. You can basically just run a video game in real life, and it will still be fun, I'm sure, and especially if you've got a DM or GM who conceptually loves that and wants to create that. Then more power to you, but it is a weird way to run a role-playing game to me. D&D is very pass-fail in its mechanics, so it does kind of program players to be scared of failure, whereas a story can continue even in the lapse of, in the case of failure. But yeah, other systems kind of encourage a little bit of failure here and there just because it furthers the story. Make bad choices that help the plot or seem logical to your character. The D&D players will often make choices that are not logical to their characters because they want to win the scenario, they want to win the combat, win the puzzle, solve the dungeon, whatever. So character goes by the wayside, where whilst I think that a lot of people who have gotten into it, particularly recently, in the lieu of actual play shows, actually want the other one. They actually want to play in character, they want a organic story, and organic story sometimes means failure is fine. I do recommend playing games that are designed to be lost, like Paranoia, for example, or Dread, or horror, like horror-based games that are kind of designed for the players to lose, or at least the players not to be quite as heroic as they are in say D&D. Paranoia is a good one just because it's very... Paranoia is like the extreme version of this, where it's completely railroaded, the players have no power and they're just going to die repeatedly in a world that doesn't care about them. And it's just a game of comedic failure. But the players are still free to do whatever they want, and they can do their best to make their failure as spectacular as possible. It really is the anti-D&D, which is extrapolated even more into the dice, where you're trying to roll under your skills. So a 1 is a critical success, and a 20 would be a critical failure. So it is genuinely like a reverse D&D. It's a really good game. I get why players might feel like a bit cheated if there's no definitive correct answer. But again, that's just not really what role-playing games are designed for. That's what video games are designed for. You've got to figure out your way to the correct solution, whereas in D&D, whatever you pick is just what happens, and the DM will build the game from then on based on that choice and into those, the parameters of what that choice caused. Something I want to say, which I've said in some other spaces regarding your point calling a storytelling, means it's really more of a story making medium. This was a good point. And perhaps it's just a better mindset to put it in. If you consider the game story making, so you're telling the story in real time as a group. And you should be in that mindset of, we are kind of telling a story, we want to have a logical progression to what we're doing, and we want what we're doing to matter or to have mattered in some way. And I think that's important. I think there's an element of ignoring that makes for kind of a floundering kind of game. There's a question within in the responses to this here. Okay, question for you: with so much from a different person, so much ad-lib / dynamic storytelling in your game, how do you hold the bar on quality? Or in other words, content created for the players to play in before the session almost always has more detail and more texture. So how do you make an ad-libbed world seem real when inevitably it's made up as you go and therefore less detailed? Yeah, I don't know. You'd have to speak to my players on whether or not I'm good at this, to be honest, because it is a tricky one. I have to flip back some of the previous question onto this one, which is that for me as well, as a player, as I'm playing the game, there are no wrong answers. So if the players are going somewhere I hadn't planned, or into a new city for the first time and I haven't really built anything for it, I just say stuff, just describe the city. Oh yeah, it's a elegant city of towers, it's skyscraper type city with big stone towers everywhere. It's like medieval Manhattan, or it's built into the side of a cliff face that's going up. It's a big mining town that's built around a cliff. I just think, again, it's that sort of, there's no wrong answers. You just have to say, just describe something in some, just add details as the players move through. And that's now the world. That just is what it is. It doesn't matter if it doesn't make sense necessarily, or if it has a few holes in it. Players will either latch onto things that interest them, or they won't. And if they interest them, you can expand on it. If they don't interest them, they don't ask questions about it, then forget it. It doesn't matter. It's a thing that's your background noise. And this is just a matter of just throwing in a few bits here and there. Just have a few design choices. So just describe a few things that are in a room. If your players are going into somewhere important, just have a vague description of the walls and ceiling and floor, just whatever it is. A piece of advice as well. I forget where I saw it, but somebody said that describe something and try to use two elements that are non-visual. So there's something you smell, something you hear, something you can feel, or like the pressure of a room, the atmosphere. So yeah, try and don't just be visual in your descriptions. Try and include other elements, and the more specific you can be, the more real it will feel. So if you give an NPC a limp, then you might have no idea why that NPC has a limp, but the fact that they have one makes the players be like, oh, okay, this is something. There's something happening here. If you describe a town as as like a section of the town as dilapidated and run down and like it's been in a war zone, then that's, you might have no idea why you've said that, but that's something that the players are like, this feels like flavour. This feels like something happened here. So the more specific and the more I want to say over the top, but not really like over the top. There must be a better word for it. You can be, the more it will feel real. I think anyway. Again, you have to ask my players if I'm good at this or not. But I think if you give like distinctive qualities to your NPCs or your places or your whatever, like some distinctive qualities, then it will feel real. Add a detail, and you can figure out what it means later. But that will make it feel real, just a little something. I really actually didn't reply to this comment, probably because there's a comment on a comment, so I might not have noticed it the first time, so I apologise to that person for not replying, but hopefully that has vaguely responded. RE the DM shortage. Here I am waiting, ready to master the Paladin, UVG or Troika, but every player advertised they want to join a D&D game, preferably from a ready adventure module they saw somewhere else. Being a DM is a good fit for people with vast imagination, and D&D system and modules are not that much enticing. So no surprise many DMs will decide to skip that system altogether. Outside of D&D, there's plenty of DMs starved for players who are open-minded enough to play something that wasn't done by Hasbro. I mean, yeah, this is why I'm running D&D, because my players want to play it. I don't massively have an interest in running it. I ran it learner games at the cafe because, again, it's D&D, it's very advertisable. The board game cafe was able to be like, hey, we're running D&D, and everyone knows what that means. So that's just kind of the way it is. People know it. People know it enough to want to play it. When they want to get into an RPG, they immediately will think D&D first, especially if they don't know much about the hobby. It just sort of is what it is. It's an annoying element, and running the game, and it's not a fun game. And I've said it before, but I don't think it's a fun game to run. I think it's a boring game to run. It's way too mechanics heavy. The modules are not very good, from my very brief experience of playing in them. And it just you immediately want to, as you're running the game, to expand outwards and create content, and do your own thing, because that's the fun part. But it's so restrictive, and if you run too wild, then the players get a little bit out of control as well, because the system is just kind of a mess. I don't know what I mean. It's a fair comment to be like, the problem with the lack of DMs is that there's too many D&D players. That's kind of the issue. There isn't a lack of DMs. There's not a lack of people who want to run this game. Loads of people want to run games. The problem is there are too many D&D players. Just play something else. I'd be interested in your view on what makes a good, rigorous, critically engaged player, opposite of lazy. Yeah, I often say lazy players are the problem, don't I? And what a new or experienced player can do to develop those capabilities. Yeah, there's a lot said about how to be a great DM, and not so much about how to be a good player. And I do think that players are the problem. Games flounder because players don't invest the right amount of energy into them, and they expect the GM to do all the work, and they're just there to goof around, and it's unfair on the GM. I am working on a video that covers this, so will hopefully cover this anyway. But I think that players can be a lot more proactive than they think they can be. They will always say like, oh, the complaint with the concept of storytelling in these games is always that, oh, players should have more agency, but players give up their agency constantly, and they will just wait until they're told what they're allowed to do, or they will pick through the rules so that they can find the exact right thing, and they won't be as creative as they want to be. I'm sure they want to be, because they think that they're not allowed to. Players need to understand that they should be trying to drive the game forward. Agency isn't just reacting to what the GM tells you is going on. You can actively try and pursue things. You can go somewhere and do something and not invent an NPC. Certain systems you can. Fate, for example, you can invent NPCs as players, but you should go seek out what you want to do. You can think, well, I want to achieve this, so I'm going to find the person or the place that suits this best, and a GM should create that for your purposes. It shouldn't be a case of trying to figure out what the GM's already thought of. Like, you have to go to the right place and talk to the right person to do the thing. That's bad play. That's railroading. You should be actively saying, well, if we want to do this, what we need to do is go to a place like this and find somebody who can do this, and you can actively push the story forward that way, rather than waiting for a option, the GM to lay out options before you and you pick the right one. You can try and actively pursue the one that you think will be best, because the truth is you have infinite options. You don't need to wait for the GM to lay them out. You have an infinite supply of options from this world. Assume that anything is an option. Everything and anything is an option, and say, well, we should try and find this, and then pursue that, and then tell the GM that's what you're doing, and then they will facilitate you doing that. You might fail. Again, there's always a possibility of failure, but they will facilitate your ideas. Tell the GM your ideas. Don't just wait to be shown a problem and wait for try and figure out the solution. Tell them your ideas. I don't know if that's. I hope that's useful. How do you separate your D&D games into combat and non-combat sessions? And the million-dollar question, of course, how do you make a compelling story? Yes, and the final comment is, I assume that a compelling story invites player agency. Yes, it absolutely does. So, this is an interesting one. This has kind of come up organically. It's not that hard to let the players riff, and every session should sort of have a goal to it, even if that goal is just like, let's go shopping, or let's get out of escape town, or whatever. And if you're not inclined to run random encounters, which I'm not, then it's quite easy to just avoid combat entirely, really. But if you have a kind of a goal for your session, and your players dictate the goal for a session, and then they aim for that, then it's quite easy to just run a session that just does a one thing. Now, I have the advantage, particularly in my Monday night game, that we play very regularly. We play probably at least once a month, I'm going to say. We miss weeks sometimes, but we play more often than we don't. But I guess the way that this works is that I only tend to run very important combats, and they're combats that you can sort of see coming. Like, eventually they know they've got to fight such and such. Rarely will they run into a room and just suddenly a combat will start. It can happen, and we might start the combat if it's suddenly as a surprise. We might start the combat in mid-session, but generally I will try and weave the game so that if that's going to happen, it's going to happen later in the session, and we can just call it, because we know we're going to be meeting probably next week to play. So we have the advantage of like, well, it's not going to like, oh no, we'd have to wait 6 months before we get to play the game again. That's really annoying. So it does help to have a regular game for sure. If you're playing not that regularly and you're playing like larger, longer sessions, say you're doing all day kind of weekend sessions, that's much trickier. Players will enjoy a big combat, in my experience anyway, because it's such an integral part of D&D. There's so many mechanics are built around it, so much of their players' abilities are built around it, that they will enjoy a big chunky combat that they can really get their teeth into, even if it takes up an entire session. And for me, it filters out the two parts of D&D into what makes them good, because the narrative and the combat just do not mesh on any level for me. They're just an absolute mess. So if I can do narrative and then run, but I can run an entirely combat session, I can have fun with both those systems because they don't go well together. So if I can run I can get really into a big combat session, and then at the end of the combat you can have a cooldown and you can get more into the narrative, the aftermath. But at a certain point, it's just a matter of just sort of doing it, just sort of have that structure in mind and be prepared to end a session early if you can see a big combat's about to take place, and just scrap random encounters. They're boring. Or theatre of the mind them, like keep them very small and theatre of the mind them. The $1,000,000 question: how do you make a compelling story? That is a huge question. Again, this video series will hopefully touch on that. But really, you've got to build the story off of what the players take interest in. If the players aren't picking up on your hooks, or they're not engaging with the NPCs you'd like them to, scrap it. Don't force that story on them. Find what they are interested in and build your story from there. Find the NPCs that intrigue them, the parts of the world that they think sound cool. Just dangle little bits in front of them, and the bits that they catch onto, that's your story. That's where your story needs to be, and you can build it from there. I'm going to move on to I'm going to move on to the next one. So the GM is a player. I'm going to look through the comments on that now. I think maybe you have a little bit of a narrow perspective on dungeon crawl games. Yeah, I do. I that's very fair to say. They're not for me. I've enjoyed designing dungeons in the past, but I don't really enjoy running them. They are a slog to run. They're just not that interesting, and yeah, I get bored very, very quickly. It's possible, in my opinion, that there are wider reaching reasons why player characters are in the dungeon. Yeah, I recognise that a dungeon can be more expansive than I'm saying it as just like a linear section of halls is kind of what I feel like I'm talking about. But yeah, a dungeon can be like a whole small society can kind of exist in a dungeon. I've run some complex dungeons. They are oddly restrictive in my mind, though. They are a contained group of parameters that this is the players want to get from one end to the other usually, or find a particular goal or do something, and it runs in a very fixed fashion. Like once you've done all the design work and the players are in there, it can only really play out two ways. Either the players succeed or they don't, and there's a lot of variability in that, sure, but ultimately you just like, you guys hurry up and get to the end so that I can think again, and so that I'm not just like ticking off, hey, you've done that one, yeah, you've dealt with that, and it just, I don't know, it just doesn't work for me. And there's definitely a mindset of players who will say that they don't want to be railroaded but do want to play in this very restrictive hack and slashy dungeon crawly kind of world, which doesn't make sense to me. That is the antithesis. Those two things don't work. You clearly do want to be railroaded, and you clearly do want to be given a limited number of parameters. You want the illusion of freedom, the illusion that you can do whatever you want, and generally speaking, the better dungeons of design that have got like multiple outcomes, but it doesn't quite make sense to me that you want to pretend that you have more agency than you actually do. Just seems kind of silly. This one starts with, I deeply apologise for this very long response. So I'm going to skim this and see what. I won't read the whole thing because it is quite long. I'll kind of skim a few points from this. I appreciate that not everyone will be able to think the way I do, and like tie everything together and keep kind of this fake design, like a fake logic to their world that they've cobbled together. And some people will benefit from having everything clearly laid out, and like there's a definite through line that the players can work towards, and they can then seed in cheeky elements early in the story, like you can say like, oh, if we've got this end secret, the conspiracy, and you can then seed in clues throughout, you can totally do that. That's fun. However, what I do is I insert random things that could be clues, could be anything, like I say, everything is something. Everything's got something. I remember, or I've written down all these little things, and then if a few of them sort of tie together, then they're like, okay, they could be parts of the conspiracy. So I retroactively create inserted clues. There's two that happened in my Monday night game that the players noticed before I did. But yeah, little like inserted clues from earlier, just because I did something that vaguely tied together, or was recognisable. Then I retroactively went back, tied them all together, and made it look like a complex conspiracy or a complex kind of flow, when that's not what I had intended at all. It's just because I'd seeded so many things. I just add stuff. Maybe this is the takeaway. Add loads of things, have lots and lots and lots of stuff, and then if there's a Mel Brooks philosophy. This is going to be a slight tangent, but the Mel Brooks kind of philosophy to filmmaking, or the way he writes, is if you just have millions of jokes. Almost every line in a Mel Brooks film is a joke. Everything that happens is a joke, and not all those jokes are going to hit. Some of those jokes are going to fall flat. But if you're bombarding your audience with jokes, then you only need one or just a few of them to hit every scene, or maybe just one every scene, and that will be amazing. That will crack your audience up, and that will you look like an absolute comedy genius. So if you just keep firing jokes, you only need a small percentage to hit. So if you just bombard your game with ideas, bombard your players with everything is something, my philosophy is to have everything be something. If you bombard all these elements, then you can pick the ones that worked, pick the ones the players liked, or the ones that made the most sense, and you can bring them all together at the end, and you can bring them back, have callbacks, have them repeat, just make everything something. Like I decried Matt Mercer a little bit in previous videos, but he is a very good DM and a very good writer for that world, but he limits the players' options. But the options he gives them are so good. The players don't go into a town and meet 10 merchants and then just find one they like. No, they meet like one merchant, but he's a really interesting character that Matt's clearly put a lot of thought into. So he's going to repeat back and forth. But if you're not confident with that, if your players go into town and they meet a bunch of merchants and they just happen to find one of them really interesting, you can just make him a main NPC. They can keep him back. You don't have to come up with Pumat Sol on your first attempt. One of the others, or Gilmore, one of your NPCs can be, he can be one of just a slew of NPCs, and he just happens to be the one the players liked the most, so you can keep bringing them back. So yes, if you just bombard your players with ideas, then you only need a few of them to hit. Then the ones that are duds will just be forgotten. It doesn't matter. That was a bad idea. You didn't feel like a failure because you can just forget that idea. But it didn't happen. Your players probably forgot it already anyway. So more is more. The opposite, not the less is more. More is more is what I'm saying. The more logical version. Something that came up here as well is that players being able to do anything. Players want to be able to do anything, but they don't want to be told that they can do anything. They want to have parameters. Like I've said in previous video, they want the railroad. They want to be railroaded, but they want the option of derailing the train. They want the option of jumping off the road and going somewhere else. They want the railroad to exist. They want to be able to see it, but they don't want to be stuck to it. And if you don't have that, they've suddenly got total freedom, like they do in Fate. Players will just draw complete blank, even though they want to be able to do whatever they want. If you tell them they can do whatever they want, they will suddenly have no idea what they want to do. So what the players really want to do is they want to break your game. They want to break the game. So I can see why a game with a lot of rules like D&D appeals, because there's like, well, how can we break these rules? Rather than like taking a game that rewards creativity, take a game that stifles creativity and be like, well, okay, we're going to break it. We're going to use our creativity to break it. We're going to find a weird use for these spells, or we're going to combine our powers into this overpowered nonsense mess that's just going to, become totally OP. And we're going to break the game because we want to be creative. And it is easier to break rules than it is to invent rules. It's easier to be creative when you're battling against something, but I think that if players just applied that same philosophy to a more narrative-led game, then they would find there's not that much difference. They're still being creative. They're just not being They're not just not pushing back against anything. They're being allowed that freedom. They don't need to feel like you are rebelling against the game or against the GM in order to feel like you are winning or feel like you are achieving something. But it's tricky. I get that it's tricky. It's I see some very good D&D players, some very professional D&D players who just become lost in a game like Fate, because they even though I know they are very creative people, they suddenly, like, the pressure is on and they can't do anything. They need the parameters to bounce against, otherwise they just kind of just analysis paralysis kind of takes over. Oh, next comment up. I think you have the OSR dungeon crawl lovers wrong here. Yeah, okay, yeah, maybe. The archetypal game is a sandbox world where, for example, there'll be multiple towns to visit, multiple dungeon fields with treasure munch. Yeah, the sandbox is overrated. I will talk about that at some point. But a sandbox of possibilities is a hugely overrated in both TTRPGs and in video games. Sandboxes are not the pinnacle of design, but yeah, that's a bigger conversation. Story in these games emerges from player interactions and from Jesus' use of random encounter tables. I do have random encounter tables. My Monday Night Group told you I have a lot of random tables, but they're not very specific. They're often kind of conceptual, and they're just kind of time for me to, like, a little spark, for me to, like, okay, I need an idea, roll on the random table, and it'll have like a seed concept. Sometimes some table just says this is bad or this is good. That's literally all it says. Like I have a D100 percentile table for encounters, and number 1 just says the worst thing that can happen, and number 100 says the best thing that can happen. So that's literally all it says, but it's kind of a jumping off point for me to be like, okay, this is what's gonna occur here, and it's hugely variable, and you can definitely generate stories, very player-led stories from this. It's not really a story, it's just a kind of an anthology of what the players have been doing. The players been goofing around, and if you've seen my previous videos where I talked about a long-running Rifts game that I ran, that's basically all that was, just kind of an anthology of the players just goofing around, and there wasn't much of a through line to it. And a couple of the players had had ideas of what they were up to, but yeah, it was a lot of just craziness sort of happening, and you can make a game that way, and it's tons of fun, I'm sure. I am under the impression that the popularity of actual play shows bringing people into the hobby is making it more inclined that players actually want a conclusion. They actually want their story to be going somewhere. I think so. I might be wrong, but I think so. If you're not that kind of player, then that's fine. If you just want to, if you can get a regular group together, I think the problem with this kind of player-led anthology style storytelling is that it definitely relies on a group that are very familiar with each other, and b, a very regular game. If you've got a good group of friends who can meet regularly, and goofing around is your goal in this world, to just create a fun story that's unique to you and is just purely based on what you want to do, then that is definitely the ideal way to play that. That's how my Rifts game worked. We were all school friends, very close school friends. We'd all grown up playing these games. We learnt the games together, and so just goofing around was perfect for us. And we met regularly. We were all still in schools. So we met at least, like once every 2 weeks or something. So yeah, that definitely works under those circumstances. Under games often now, though, you're often playing online, often with people you've only just met. You might have a limited amount of time. You don't know if you're going to meet regularly. That kind of play is less suited to that. I would like to hope that I'm offering advice to people who are running into those circumstances. If you've got a close group of friends and you know how your game runs, you don't need my advice. You don't need anyone's advice. You've probably got into a nice little situation where you're running the game precisely how you guys want, and that's fantastic. You maybe just need practical advice from someone like Matt Colville, or somebody who is giving practical dungeon mastering advice on how to best implement the rules of the game, or expand on your kind of concepts and ideas, whereas I'm giving more conceptual advice to people who are looking to run games with who are newer to it, and who are running things in a different way, perhaps more inspired by actual play shows like Critical Role. to play in the first place. So yeah, I think you're right that I don't really understand. Well, I do understand, but I'm not talking to them. I'm not speaking to those those players who have got their niche and they know where they want to be. So I'm not going to be helpful, and I'm not going to pretend that I have got the answer for everyone's problems. I don't have the answer to everyone's problems. If you're running the game that you love, then you're running the game that you love. What the hell do you care that I think? I'm trying to talk to people who are maybe not sure what they're doing, or maybe trying to figure out, maybe they're bouncing off of the hobby and they're not quite sure what the problem is. So hopefully I can highlight some things that maybe make things better, because it's a wonderful hobby with a plethora of options, and I really think that everyone could find their way through it. Why are you so supremely confident that you know what all the players of TTRPGs really want? I mean, it's the internet, isn't it? We've all got very strong opinions here. I can't sit here and talk as if I don't think I know what I'm talking about, because what's the point of doing that? I have to take kind of a strong stance and just stick with it. But I don't know what everybody wants. I'm just trying to hopefully maybe shine a light on some things that problems that you might be having that you might not realise you're having, or maybe trying to help you navigate your way through as you kind of bounce it off the hobby. And if you don't want the style of game that I'm talking about, that's fine. You don't need to listen to me. In fact, don't listen to me. It's crazy. But if you are listening to me, then maybe you might find that you're butting up against the game and having trouble retention and keeping your own interest. And you might be exploring, trying to figure out why that is. In which case, maybe give me a listen, and maybe I've got one or two things somewhere that's useful or helpful to say that can highlight what the problem that you're having. But yeah, I mean, I think my methodology is the best way to play, because that's how I enjoy playing, and I don't really enjoy the mechanical elements of D&D. I just don't think they're that interesting. So and a lot of people fall into D&D because it dominates the hobby so much. So if you like the idea of role playing, you've watched these actual play shows, and you like this, the concept of it, but when you get to D&D, you're like, whoa, this is way too, there's too much math being thrown in my face, or whatever. You might get turned away from the hobby. But yeah, I want to highlight that. It's good. Don't worry. There's other things, and there's other ways to play, and maybe it's just the D&D isn't the game for you. It's not necessarily the game for me. The other thing, and how I responded to this, is actually because I watch a lot of these Dungeon Master advice kind of channels, and so many of them are like, well, here's how you bend the rule, or here's the rules that you should ignore, or here's some homebrew elements, or here's some little bits and bobs to change. And so many of them are doing that without acknowledging that the problem is that D&D clearly doesn't work for these games. Please play something else. Don't continually modify D&D until it fits. You maybe should be playing something else. I play D&D, and I fall into that. I might well fall into that category of people that shouldn't be playing D&D because they modify it so much. But I play a lot of other games. I play more other games than I play D&D. And I've just got 2 long-running D&D games because that's what they kind of became. One was a Tal'Dorei game where I met with people online who I met in order to play that game, as part of the Tal'Dorei Monday server, and the other is a group of friends who wanted to play D&D, and so when we sort of first started out. So yeah, I'm running those 2 D&D games, but I run more other games, and I play in more a wider variety of games. So yeah, you can play D&D, but if you bounce off it really hard, then just explore the rest of the hobby. And like I say, if you don't want that, then you don't want that. That's fine. That's fine. I'm just trying to help the people that have, like I say, found their way into the hobby and are confused about why it isn't working for them. There's more comments. I've tried to tackle the ones that were directly asking me questions or making points that I really thought to be done. I apologise if I didn't get to yours. I don't want this video to go on forever. But yeah, I tried to tackle as much of the comments that I thought were interesting there. I will come back to them, do my best to feed them into the ideas that I've had for the other videos. Hopefully next week I'll be coming out with the player's responsibility. That'll be the title of the next one. And then we will expand, therefore, hopefully into some more practical advice on how to kind of craft these elements into your game, and think about story in a way that, you know, it keeps player agency, because I will always say that I think story is key, but also like it's got to be born of the players. So yeah, the player's responsibility is the next video, and hopefully that expands on that concept. As always, my links are all below. If you want to donate to this channel, we have a Ko-fi support page. We are currently trying to gather money so that we can buy equipment, and the rental house that I worked for went under, so I am fully freelance now, fully freelance sound recordist and designer and production assistant, and doing all filmy stuff at the moment, and I'm pushing this channel obviously, but I no longer have access to all the equipment that I had before, but they are auctioning it off because the company went bust, so I'm trying to get hold of some bits of it if I can get hold of a few bits, especially the ones that we used before. That would be great. So yeah, so we've got a goal of £2,000 on the Ko-fi at the moment. So if you want to donate anything at all, as it says on the site, just donate £2 for a cup of coffee. It all goes towards that goal, and that would be absolutely fantastic that we can push towards that and try and get the studio fully equipped with camera gear. Which is kind of the one thing I don't have. Check out everything else, all my other playlists, all my other RPG stuff, the actual play stuff that we've got going out at the moment. We're going to start doing more. We did a live thing last week. I'm going to try and do more live things, which could be fun, because it's now I've got, you know, a little bit more time on my hands. Thank you for watching. Please do like and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. The end.